Thank you. Yeah, it's a huge honor to be invited and to share this work with this audience. So I'm going to try to share my screen and start the presentation. Okay, great. So let's get started. So as Brent said, my name is Joel Gombiner, and I'm at the University of Washington. And today I'll be speaking about some new work on the huge floods that drained through Moses Coulee in the channeled scabland of Washington. Moses Coulee is part of the channeled scabland, which is a network of dry canyons in central Washington state that formed during Pleistocene megaflooding episodes. And Moses Coulee is one of the more poorly understood parts of this megaflood system. Fortunately, much of the original landscape of Moses Coulee remains undisturbed by modern development, and this makes it an excellent place to conduct geological research. The channeled scabland, as I'm sure you know, were eroded during outburst floods that occurred along the southern margin of the Cordilleran ice sheet. And glacial Lake Missoula, which formed when the Purcell Trench lobe of the ice sheet impounded the Clark Fork tributary of the Columbia River, was likely the source for the largest floods. The channeled scabland consists of 4 primary drainage routes eroded deep into Columbia River basalts, and these canyonlands are clearly visible on satellite imagery as darker brown scars. The scabland drainages are separated by higher interfluves that remained above the floodwaters and retain their soils during floods. The Moses Coulee drainage is the westernmost drainage line in the channeled scabland. However, unlike the other 3 drainage tracts, it is not fully eroded back to the Columbia River, and it heads obscurely here in the middle of the Waterville Plateau. One of the outstanding features of the channeled scabland is the interconnectivity of the entire drainage system, as noted by Bretz in his 1923 Journal of Geology paper. However, he noted one exception to this general rule, Moses Coulee. And the lack of connectivity noted by Bretz has been explored further recently in numerical flood models, revealing a problem with water routing. This map shows the topography of the western part of the channeled scabland, with the color scheme chosen to highlight the low relief topography here on the Waterville Plateau. And this area is between the head of Moses Coulee here and the Columbia River here. Megafloods overflowing out of the Columbia River and into Moses Coulee would have flowed over this area, in this area here, and they should have eroded channels and left behind other evidence of their passage. However, subsequent glaciation by the Okanagan lobe also eroded this area and buried parts of it with glacial debris, obscuring the prior effects of megafloods. And this map shows in black features called the Mansfield channels. And these features were first identified, I believe, by Larry Hansen, who identified them as the channels or the conduits that conveyed water out of Grand Coulee into Foster Coulee, across the Waterville Plateau, and into the head of Moses Coulee. The next slide. So the problem is that flood models run with current day topography are not able to route significant amounts of floodwater into Moses Coulee through this pathway. So if the Columbia River is blocked by the Okanagan lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet, flood drainage down the Columbia River is diverted into Grand Coulee, which is so wide and so deep in its current form that it can easily drain the flood that results when the full pool Lake Missoula instantaneously drains out into the Columbia River. And these are results from the flood models of Denlinger and others. And in these models, however, if Upper Grand Coulee is reverted to its pre-erosional form, if they fill the Upper Coulee in with rock, and then they block the Columbia River with ice and run a flood down it. Then water is able to spill across the water-filled plateau and into Moses Coulee. The problem is that inferences from glacial Lake Columbia deposits indicate that Grand Coulee was not, however, filled in with rock at the time when the Okanagan lobe first blocked the Columbia River. And at the same time, megaflood deposits in Moses Coulee indicate that Moses Coulee did have huge floods during the same time period. So now I want to go through a few possible solutions to this apparent paradox of water routing into Moses Coulee. One possibility is that last glacial floods into Moses Coulee did not come from the Columbia River and Lake Missoula, but instead came from subglacial outbursts from the Okanagan lobe. And this hypothetical drainage pathway is driven by subglacial hydropotential. It's unaffected by the form of Grand Coulee. Another possible solution is that Upper Grand Coulee was simply narrower during the floods into Moses Coulee. And so when the Columbia River was blocked by ice and Missoula floods came down it, water was able to rise higher in Upper Grand Coulee and spill into Moses Coulee. And this possibility has not actually been tested in flood models. A third possibility is that the mouth of Upper Grand Coulee became choked with gravel as floodwaters came down Upper Grand Coulee, expanded into Heartline Basin, and deposited what's known as the Heartline Expansion Bar. And there's remnants of this gravel bar still present in Heartline Basin. And this impediment to flow could have hypothetically allowed floodwaters to rise higher in Upper Grand Coulee and spill into Moses Coulee. So we have been trying to investigate these different possibilities using at least two methods. I'm actually going to go into a third one, but let me start with two. The first is surface exposure dating of flood and glacially transported boulders to provide the timing of megafloods and ice recession. And the second method is geochemical and isotope analysis of flood silts as a proxy for the source of the floodwater. And to show you where I'm going, the two main findings from this work are that the surface exposure dating suggests that Moses Coulee flooded before Grand Coulee during the last glaciation. And this is consistent with the Coulee modification solution, with the Grand Coulee modification solution to Moses Coulee water routing. And the second finding is that the silt provenance in Moses Coulee megaflood deposits suggests that Lake Missoula was the source for at least some of the last glacial Moses Coulee floods. So this result provides no evidence for the subglacial flood hypothesis, but it also doesn't fully rule it out. Upper Moses Coulee here widens into Sagebrush Flats Basin, which is a zone where floodwaters coming down Moses Coulee slowed down and deposited sediment. And this reach of Moses Coulee is above the elevation where floodwaters from the Columbia River backed up into Moses Coulee, and it's also downstream of where the Okanagan lobe reached into Moses Coulee. So now we're going to focus in on Sagebrush Flats Basin, which is where we found a lot of the evidence for Moses Coulee megafloods. So this satellite image of part of our study area shows some of the complex erosional forms that resulted from the interaction of megafloods and basaltic bedrock. Some of the distinctive scabland features include anastomosing bedrock channels, circular depressions eroded into bedrock, large bouldery gravel deposits, and these red dots show crystalline rocks, quartzites, granites, and gneisses that are scattered across the landscape. And these rocks can be dated, the exposure age of these rocks can be dated using the beryllium-10 concentration in clean quartz. So this photo gallery shows 6 crystalline erratics from Moses Coulee with their exposure ages shown. in thousands of years before present. And the errors are shown as internal errors to the left of the slash and external errors to the right of the slash. And these ages are produced from beryllium-10 concentrations measured at Lawrence Livermore National Lab Center for Accelerator Mass Spectrometry. The ages here range from 14 to 29,000 years old. To begin with, we interpret the 29,000 year age on this quartzite cobble as likely to reflect pre-exposure of the cobble prior to its deposition in Moses Coulee. So we're kind of going to ignore that age, but keep it in the back of our heads. So this plot shows those 6 exposure ages on the flood transported boulders from Moses Coulee, shown in the previous slide. And it shows them alongside exposure ages from flood transported boulders in the Ephrata Fan, which represent the age of floods down Grand Coulee. And it also shows exposure ages from glacially transported boulders on the Waterville, Omak, and Elmira plateaus, which I've grouped together as deglaciation ages for the Okanagan lobe. And the x-axis down here is the apparent exposure age in thousands of years before present. And the y-axis is just the rank of the age from youngest to oldest. So now I want to look in more detail at each of these 6 exposure ages and these 6 samples from Moses Coulee. So let's start with the youngest age. So this angular granitic boulder from which that age comes is buried in a sandy silt deposit. And it's possible that this boulder was exhumed from a thicker silt deposit after its time of deposition. It's easy to imagine that this rock was shielded from cosmic radiation, which causes the buildup of beryllium-10, before being exposed at some time after the original deposition. So that would make that age too young, or a minimum age. And let's look at the next oldest age. Similarly, this boulder is also embedded in silt. Let's look at the next. This boulder is also embedded in a sandy silt deposit. And this sandy silt is probably a waning stage flood deposit. There could also be some components of loess in here that would have buried these boulders after they were deposited, and then that finer material was winnowed away, exposing the boulder after its time of deposition. Let's look at the next oldest exposure age. This granitic cobble is actually perched on a very different type of deposit. It's on a thin, rocky deposit. And here there's fewer signs of evidence for burial and later exhumation. And finally, let's look at the oldest last glacial age for a flood boulder in Moses Coulee. This boulder is also perched on a rockier deposit, and it has by far the highest relief above the surface of any of the boulders that we've sampled and dated in Moses Coulee. So despite the apparent overlap between the surface exposure ages for Moses Coulee floods and Grand Coulee floods, the younger Moses Coulee ages are all from boulders that are embedded in sandy silt, whereas the older ages are from boulders that are perched on rockier deposits. So for this reason, we favor the 2 older ages as most likely representative of the true age of the Moses Coulee floods. So further evidence for Moses Coulee floods preceding Grand Coulee floods comes from Moses Coulee Bar, which formed at the mouth of Moses Coulee, where floodwaters coming down lower Moses Coulee expanded into the Columbia River and deposited sediment. Additionally, this deposit contains sediment from floods that came down Grand Coulee into the Quincy Basin, spilled into the Columbia River, and backed up the Columbia River towards Moses Coulee. So the basaltic sand in this deposit has been interpreted as down Moses Coulee floods, whereas the overlying clayey silt rhythmites have been interpreted as originating from floods that likely traveled down Grand Coulee and backed up the Columbia River. This overall stratigraphy suggests, and by the way, Richard Waite is one of the people who pioneered descriptions of this sequence, and I'm only showing the top part of it here. And so this stratigraphy suggests that the Moses Coulee flood ceased at a certain point, while floods coming out of Grand Coulee continued to occur. So this sequence of events is consistent with the idea that deepening or widening or fully opening of Grand Coulee during the last glaciation eventually shut off drainage to Moses Coulee and enhanced, or at least continued to allow megaflood flows through Grand Coulee. And back to the initial possibilities of how water got into Moses Coulee, the sequence of Moses Coulee flooding before Grand Coulee is consistent with both the subglacial flood hypothesis, as well as the hypothesis that changing topography in Upper Grand Coulee changed water routing into Moses Coulee. So now I want to talk about a more direct way to determine the source of Moses Coulee megafloods, and that is by analyzing the sediment that was transported during the floods and brought into Moses Coulee to determine its ultimate source. So to do this and to discriminate between the two potential flood sources, we're going to begin by analyzing some of the source rock geology and sediment transport pathways. And here, this map shows the topography of Western North America. We've just been looking in this region over here. And this is the area over which the Cordilleran ice sheet developed. So at its maximum, the Cordilleran ice sheet formed a large dome of ice that covered these mountains. And ice flow and sediment transport were from the north to the south. These glacial systems transported sediment that originated from within their catchments, and that sediment derived from the unique assemblage of bedrock within each catchment system. Now, the eastern part of the southern Cordilleran ice sheet formed over some very unique rocks that are quite different from the rocks in the west. And these are Proterozoic sedimentary rocks that include the Belt-Purcell supergroup. Now, most of these low-grade metasedimentary rocks never experienced the heating that would have reset their potassium argon ages. So now I'm showing a map of all potassium argon ages for this entire region, and I'm only plotting the ages from 500 to 2,500 million years ago. And you can see that such old ages only really occur in the eastern part of the southern Cordilleran ice sheet. Now, the glaciers that were flowing into Glacial Lake Missoula and transporting sediment into that lake were eroding and transporting this Proterozoic rock. So for that reason, the sediment that accumulated in Glacial Lake Missoula has potassium argon ages from 600 to over 700 million years old. And this reflects these Proterozoic source rocks. Now, in contrast, areas to the west experienced widespread Cenozoic and Mesozoic magmatism that reset the potassium argon ages. So in this area, the potassium argon ages of bedrock range from 0 to 200 million years old, and you just don't see those ancient ages. So if we look at the varves in Glacial Lake Columbia, the composition of the sediment there has a potassium argon age of only 120 million years old. And this age reflects a mixture of all of these Cenozoic and Mesozoic ages. So we assume, we don't know for sure, but we assume that material that would emerge in a hypothetical Okanagan subglacial flood would have had a similarly young potassium argon age to the material that accumulated in Glacial Lake Columbia, whereas material coming in from a Glacial Lake Missoula flood should have had a much older age. So now, to test whether floodwaters in Moses Coulee had a Lake Missoula or an Okanagan source, we sampled flood gravels in Moses Coulee, and we extracted the 20 to 63 micron fraction of silt from these gravels. And we also sampled gravels in the Ephrata Fan, and these serve as somewhat of a control because we have a strong reason to believe that the source for the floods coming down Grand Coulee into the Ephrata Fan was indeed glacial Lake Missoula. So Moses Coulee megaflood sediment, we sampled from a feature that is in upper Moses Coulee that Brett's called the Great Bar. This is the feature here. And we sampled this by digging a pit into the surface of the Great Bar and sampling material from two different depths, between about 50 and 80 centimeters below the surface. And this clast-supported cobble gravel contains subangular basaltic clasts with interstitial sand and silt. And the reason we didn't sample the gravel is that it's simply 100% locally derived basalt. So we're looking at the material, the finer material that came in with the floods, not the material that was locally derived. So we sampled the Ephrata Fan above the fish hatchery, and we sampled it at two different stratigraphic levels. At a lower level, there's a massive bouldery diamict, and at the upper level, we sampled a sandier cobble gravel. So as I mentioned, while the pebbles and cobbles and boulders in these deposits are mostly basalt, or in this case, there's a fair proportion of granite derived from Upper Grand Coulee, the silt has an entirely different chemistry. The silt is intermediate to felsic in composition, which you can see here in the silica values for the silts that came out of these gravels. And you can compare that to the silica composition in the Columbia River basalt, which is much, much lower, having a more mafic composition. So this chemical data tells us that the silt was not derived locally from Columbia River basalts, but it doesn't allow us to say where that silt came from. So for this, we turned to the potassium argon age, which varies so clearly between the Lake Missoula source and the Okanagan lobe source. And this work to study the potassium argon age of the silt was done by a PhD student named Jack Carter, who was working at the University of Glasgow. And what Jack did is he performed argon-argon step heating experiments to probe the ages of the source components in the silts. So in these experiments, aliquots of that 20 to 63 micron silt are irradiated with neutrons to convert some of the potassium into argon-39, which allows measurement of the potassium argon age by simply measuring argon isotope ratios. In these experiments, gas from within the crystal lattices of the silt is sequentially released at progressively higher temperatures, and this degasses different mineral domains in each step. So now I'm gonna go into some of the data. This is the argon-argon step heating data for the Ephrata Fan silts. And what you're seeing here are fairly complex age spectra, which reflect the combination of many different sources with different ages and different closure temperatures. But the main point is that most of the age steps are between 200 and about 350 million years, which is much older than the material that would have been coming out of the Okanagan lobe, and consistent with a mixture of that 700 million year old Lake Missoula material with younger material that the Missoula floods would have encountered as they flowed through glacial Lake Columbia and entrained younger silt. So this indicates what we kind of already knew, which is that the Ephrata Fan likely formed from glacial Lake Missoula floods. And now turning to the Moses Coulee silts, we also see that the silts have age spectra which are significantly older than the Okanagan source rocks. So this suggests that at least some of the last glacial Moses Coulee floods derived from Lake Missoula and not that Okanagan subglacial source. So these data are obviously incredibly complex. They're not easy to interpret because we're talking about mixtures of silt from hundreds or thousands of different bedrock sources. But it's very difficult to explain any of these data with silt that's entirely sourced from the Okanagan lobe. And it's a lot easier to explain it as a mixture of silt coming out of Lake Missoula and mixing with younger material. So the bottom line is that the silt provenance data favor the hypothesis that floods from Lake Missoula spilling out of the Columbia River were the source of the Moses Coulee megafloods. But it still remains unclear what conditions exactly allowed floodwater to climb up onto the Waterville Plateau and get into Moses Coulee. So that remains to be understood. So I'm just going to reiterate the two main findings from the first part of the talk. I think then I'll take a few questions, and then I'll go into one other interesting deposit from Moses Coulee. So actually, I'll just go through that, and then we'll do questions at the end. So the first part is that the surface exposure dating suggests that Moses Coulee flooded before Grand Coulee, which I would say is consistent with the Grand Coulee modification solution to Moses Coulee water routing. In other words, changes in upper Grand Coulee allowed floodwater to get into Moses Coulee and then shut off drainage to Moses Coulee at a certain point. And the second part is that, and by the way, there could be other explanations for that. That's not, I haven't directly shown anything really to do with that. And the second part is that the silt provenance in Moses Coulee suggests that Lake Missoula was the source for at least some of the Moses Coulee floods. So now I want to go back to this part of Moses Coulee. We're back here where the upper Coulee begins to widen out into Sagebrush Flats Basin. And I want to look at some evidence for more ancient megafloods. So these two white dots showed buried calcretes. And I'm going to show you what this deposit looks like. So we're looking at a side view of one of those white dots. And what you see here is a thick pile of sediment. At the top, there's a gray bouldery diamict. This probably was deposited during a last glacial megaflood in Moses Coulee. Under that is a layer of silt. This probably represents loess that accumulated before that megaflood. And below that, you see this white layer that's resistant to erosion. And this is an ancient calcrete soil that I believe is developed on top of a megaflood deposit from an older glaciation. So let's zoom in on that deposit. And here's my interpretation of the stratigraphy here. So here's what that gravel at the bottom of the sequence looks like. You can see there's sub-rounded to angular clasts of basalt. And then on top of that, there's this white material that consists of calcite that formed, and this is an ancient soil. So when calcite forms, it incorporates uranium into its structure because uranium is soluble in water, and it rejects thorium from its structure since thorium is basically insoluble in water. And this phenomenon can be used to determine the age of calcite because uranium, that uranium that's incorporated into the structure begins decaying into thorium. So the thorium that didn't get incorporated into the initial calcite begins to build back up over time. And you can use that to figure out how old these soils are. So these 6 squares represent places where we took samples of this calcrete and we attempted to do uranium series dating on it to determine the age of that soil formation. And since this soil formed on top of this gravel, if my interpretation of this gravel as an old megaflood deposit is correct, which we could talk more about, then obviously this gravel is even older than whatever ages this soil is. So the problem with dating calcrete soils is that they tend to be very open systems. So these things form from groundwater that precipitates calcite, but then that groundwater keeps moving through the deposit and it may redissolve that calcite and reprecipitate it, or it may leach uranium preferentially out of the calcite. And in that case, you can get anomalous values that result in uranium series ages that are simply too old or not datable whatsoever. So you can see here that So these two samples that have one second, that have these 230 thorium to 238 uranium activity ratios significantly greater than 1, that indicates that uranium has been preferentially stripped out of the calcrete after it formed, and these things can't be dated. And this process, this preferential loss of the parent isotope, would create an age that's artificially old. So if this is occurring in all the samples, none of the ages can be believed. So want to look a little more closely at the samples that have likely uranium loss and the ones that don't, and you'll see that the textures are actually pretty different. And so potentially, we're still working on this, but potentially some of these ages are actually believable. So, so as I mentioned, the presence of uranium loss in some samples suggests that all of the ages could be biased old by preferential leaching. And so these two samples, you can't even calculate an age because they have uranium thorium ratios that are not possible to achieve through radioactive decay. But these other samples, we could calculate ages, and these are the nominal ages, and that you can see they're all over the place. They range from as young as 5,000 years to as old as 220,000 years. And so we're still trying to figure out what this all means, but this is the texture of one of those samples that had uranium loss. And you can see that it has fairly porous texture, and it's a very powdery material. And so this is what material that's been leached and has had uranium loss looks like. So I was actually told not to sample this, but I was too curious and I sampled it anyways. And then I got what was expected. And so this ratio of 230 thorium to 238 uranium is indicative of an extreme amount of leaching and uranium loss. So you can see this sample has a completely different texture. You can see that it's much denser and it actually has cleavage planes. And at the bottom here, you can see that this sparkly stuff has a crystalline texture. And so this sample gave nominal ages from 130 to 220,000 years old. And so, I think these are more believable ages simply because the texture between these two samples is so different. But to really prove this, what we want to do is take a couple more spots from this layer and see if they give the same age, and that would actually convince us that that's a true age for this calcrete soil. Otherwise, we're left with the possibility that these ages are simply the result of uranium loss, kind of biasing the ages old. So this extra calcrete part is very much a work in progress that we're still figuring out. But that's about all I have for tonight. So I'm happy to go back to any slides and explain anything in more detail, take any questions on Moses Cooley. And once again, I really appreciate the invitation and the chance to speak with the group. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Joel. So if anybody has any questions, you can quickly type them into the question and answer or chat box, and we can get together and see if Joel will answer those for us. If not, we'll wait a few minutes and see if anybody's got any questions. So do you think I guess a quick question would be then, do you think some of this, the formation of Moses Cooley appears to be done prior to maybe the final erosion of the upper Grand Coulee, so that some of that water could have come in and overtopped the west side where like Foster Coulee is and whatever, and then drop down into what they call the Mansfield channels, and then down into upper Moses Coulee in that way. Do you think, is that basically your thought, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's one possibility. That's one way to get water in there. I'm not sure how else to do it. I'm open to any other ideas, but yeah, that there's that basic problem that if you have Grand Coulee fully open as it is in its present geometry, there's no configuration of the Okanagan lobe that will route water into Moses Coulee, even with the largest Missoula flood. And so one other possibility I didn't mention is that you have the erosion changing the topography, but you also have the actual mass of the ice lobe depressing the crust and potentially tilting it due to glacial isostatic adjustment. So if everything was kind of tilted to the west, the divide into Moses Coulee over here would have been lower. So something about the topography has to be different to come up with a way to route surface water into Moses Coulee. At least that's my understanding from what they're seeing in these geoclaw simulations. And there could be something wrong with the simulations, but I think they're pretty good. And so, but like I mentioned, if you look at the history of glacial Lake Columbia, when it first formed due to the Okanagan lobe blockage, it was at a level set by the current inlet to Grand Coulee, which is at about 1,700 feet, around 485 meters. So that indicates that the inlet to Upper Grand Coulee was open. So that's the paradox, is that it seems like Grand Coulee was open at the time that water somehow got into Moses Coulee. I think it's still a bit of a puzzle, to be honest.
Yeah. So what about the Okanagan lobe plugging, the Columbia Valley to the north of, say, in the Bridgeport area or whatever? I mean, and you're having natural flow out Grand Coulee, with the blockage of the Okanagan lobe. At some point when there's big floods coming in from Glacial Lake Missoula, would that be enough, do you think, to overtop into Moses Coulee or not?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that when they run even the largest flood, it's not enough to.
Oh, okay.
Let me see if I can go back to, can't remember which exact slide it is. So I'm just drawing a sketch of what they see in the models, but whether this ice margin is here or whether it's further back or whether it's further forward, you always have the problem that there's just this huge outlet right here in Grand Coulee. And so that's able to just take, the water never gets high enough to really route huge amounts of water into Moses Coulee.
Okay.
Joel, could I ask something?
Absolutely.
Well, first of all, we got in the chat a comment from Scrooge that they think Moses Coulee, their feeling is Moses Coulee was older, like way older than Grand Coulee, which brings up a question I was going to ask. I've lost track of where that calcrete and possibly older flood deposit is. Was that in Moses Coulee?
That was in Moses Coulee. So,
does that add to the possible explanations in terms of having earlier flood, mega flood erosion, like maybe 130,000 or whatever, much significantly older event that got it going? And
well, I mean, yeah, the canyon itself could have formed a million years ago, but the surface exposure dating has boulders over 100 meters above the floor of Moses Coulee. So that tells you that there was a huge flood there during the last glaciation, at the time when there's also evidence that this inlet to Grand Coulee was at the same elevation it is today. So, yeah.
It's a puzzle.
It is very much a puzzle.
Which hopefully you'll keep circling around and maybe narrow down the possibilities even more as your work continues. Okay, one other question. The mixed or possibly mixed, the ages from potassium or from argon that look like they're old enough that it had to have a significant, a strong Glacial Lake Missoula component, but
Mhm,
they're not just Glacial Lake Missoula. They go down to a younger average and younger ages,
mhm.
like from the west of there. Like, could that be from just picking up a lot of Okanagan lobe and nearby north of Glacial Lake Columbia outwash that dumped into that area where the Glacial Lake Missoula source flood came through? Do you think it could have just picked up enough outwash from that part of the Cordilleran ice sheet instead of having another like a simultaneous flood from under that part of the Cordilleran ice sheet?
Yeah, that's what I think happened. I mean, the flood out of Lake Missoula comes into Lake Columbia, which is full of silt coming off the Okanagan lobe and the Sandpoil lobe and the Columbia lobe, and that stuff all mixes together, and then you end up with a mixture of material from this part of the ice sheet and from Lake Missoula.
Okay.
You don't need an Okanagan lobe at all. What I was kind of looking for was, do we see material that's so young that it doesn't seem like it has that Lake Missoula component in it,
Okay.
and instead it's a little too old to be entirely the Okanagan lobe component. So it has to have a little bit of the Lake Missoula to get it as old as it is.
Got it.
Yeah, it's definitely a mixture of outwash from the Okanagan lobe, from the Columbia River lobe. Everything that's coming into Lake Columbia gets mixed in there.
And then, okay, there's also a problem in the Wenatchee area where the highest iceberg rafted boulders call for a significantly deeper flood than the most recent modeling.
Mm-hmm.
But there might be a connection between that and the Moses Coulee problem, or there might not. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I was at GSA today, and there was at least one talk about that problem, and one of the solutions that's been proposed is that it's just due to bulking of the floodwaters with sediment. But the person who presented said that you need about 2,000 cubic kilometers of bulk, whether it's water or sediment, to get to those high water marks.
Wow.
And there's not that much sediment present in the system. But there I didn't show it, but there is evidence for a lot of subglacial water flow on the Waterville Plateau and to the north. Whether it's a mega flood is unclear. So yeah, I mean, it does continue to point, that modeling, that mismatch with the high water marks does continue to point to the need for more water from somewhere.
Okay.
But I was kind of hoping to find clear evidence for that in Moses Coulee, because it's difficult to explain with the surface water flow. So it seemed like a good place to look for sort of clear evidence for a subglacial flood. But I haven't found anything that I think is clear evidence yet.
Okay.
So yeah, that's another kind of big mystery. Like, how do you get the water that high? And it's not just Wenatchee, it's all throughout the Columbia River that the models are like 50 to 100 meters lower than the high water marks. I mean, another possibility is that, I mean, I've heard another possibility that I've considered. I don't know what smarter people think about this, but just that the base, just the floor of the Columbia River is higher. Maybe it's filled up with sediment at the time of the flood. But then I've heard Vic Baker say, well, when the flood comes through, it's so energetic that it would have just stripped everything away, and all the sediment would be in suspension. So
yeah, Baker has an argument I've heard him referred to, for at least in the Wenatchee stretch, why I'd have to check with him and his paper for the argument, and you've probably heard this too, what you're saying, but that it's the base, the level of channel of the Columbia River now is not that different from what it was when the flood started occurring, based on his reasoning and field evidence. So that, which doesn't, so there's not, that doesn't seem to be the solution.
mm-mm.
Anybody else?
Well, I'm not seeing anything in the question and answer or the chat, so with that, I think appreciate you giving us the presentation, Joel. Very interesting. Glad to hear that somebody is going to work on Moses Cooley, and we'll get hopefully some more answers on the history of that. And thanks again.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm bummed I didn't get to come out to Wenatchee, but
Yeah.
you know, maybe
Well, hopefully in the future.
maybe next time.
Okay. Thanks again.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. Hopefully I didn't confuse you. I mean, I'm confused, so hopefully I did confuse you, but in a good way.